Hi, everyone. So I'm working with the Civic Features Lab, and this semester, one of my roles was to help with the mapping of anti-protester legislation, oil and gas infrastructure, of course, and environmental advocacy organizations. Great. So one of the big focuses of our lab is the study of how criminalization of advocacy is around and it exists. And so one of our focuses is to better understand criminalization and more importantly, how do environmental advocacy groups react and adapt to this criminalization? So like a brief overview of the topic. So the overall study is kind of wanting to understand the role in which environmental advocacy organizations organize to right the imbalance of information between fossil fuel companies and communities, of course, where petrochemical infrastructure is being built. And so as we've seen pretty much since around 2016, more and more anti-protest legislation is being introduced to combat the influence of these groups and specifically criminalize a lot of their activity to advocate for themselves. So in essence, they're criminalizing many of their techniques for fixing this imbalance. And of course, marginalized communities often end up being the place where petrochemical infrastructure is built. So at the heart of this, of course, is an issue of environmental justice. So the question in this presentation is there a spatial association between pipeline activity, whether that be construction or advocacy, and anti-protester legislation? So the methods, we identified legislation through keywords and analyzed similar language across bills, specifically being pushed by some of these interest groups. And then from there, we mapped and categorized progress and outcome of the bill to kind of create a key. And so then we workshop various color keys to capture, oh, sorry, I think it got messed up. So we workshop various color keys to capture all the possible ways in which these bills could exist. And so from here, this is just the plain map. So we're looking here at from 2017 to 2020, we're looking at all the bills that were introduced in various states. And we're looking at kind of their status and of course the partisanship of the state from where they come from. And so what we wanted to do is what we were really interested in seeing is if pipelines exist, are there bills being put? And so as we can see, as it moves from 2017, 2018, 2019 is a pretty important year. As you can see, kind of the bills sort of follow where these pipelines are. So are we seeing if the pipelines are influencing the bills more, or if the organizations are influencing the bills themselves? So here we have the organizations mapped. And so there's some interesting relationships between states that do see pipeline activity but have little organizations, and states with very little activity and a lot of organizations, like in the West Coast, and for example, like Texas, that has a lot of pipeline activity but not as much like advocacy work compared to some other states. So some brief conclusions. There appears somewhat of a spatial relationship. However, it's not completely understood. Using GIS, we can begin to understand the spatial component that is critically important in understanding how this kind of legislation proliferates and kind of spreads. So next steps would be a statistical analysis to better understand the partisanship role that is at play and the role of environmental advocacy in these bills as well. So thank you. Yeah, I want to thank Dr. Kirchauer and Sherry Wasserman for their guidance and patience this semester. Thank you.
Hi everyone. My research focus was to investigate the unique success of Uruguay in the face of COVID-19 and to examine the effect the pandemic has had on its education system. As an innovation in society major, my goal is to prepare for more equitable futures for all, especially those often left behind. To me, quality education access is one of the absolutely vital pathways toward these better futures. As such, I have a special interest in Latin America. Throughout this region, most countries have very high income inequality, which oftentimes is a symptom of significant social, technological, and/or political issues. These possible pre-existing conditions combined with the pandemic is a cause for great concern when considering both short and long-term effects on the country's education system and population. If the current school-age generation is deprived of an education, the future becomes quite volatile. My research began by scouring the news to gauge how Latin America has fared through the pandemic and to look for any obvious outliers. Given the turbulent political climate of many countries in the region, the findings were generally grim. However, Uruguay quickly rose to the top as the country who has prevailed. There are a number of factors that made this result somewhat expected, but perhaps the best summation is that Uruguay has a unique habit of defying regional trends. I want to note that the word success throughout this presentation is relative, which is to say that while Uruguay has fared better, people are still being infected by the virus and are still dying. However, when we use success in this context, we mean that the infection rate and the fatality rate are relatively much lower than in other countries, both regionally and globally. And it would be fair to say that Uruguay has displayed unparalleled resilience this year in managing COVID-19. My research attributed Uruguay's resilience to its foundation of education-based policies and a society that is both highly engaged and highly politically satisfied. In this graph, we see one unique example of Uruguay's societal success. The lower the number, the greater the income equality. The countries are listed vertically from greatest inequality to least. Note that Uruguay surpassed the US in 2013 for better income equality, a testament to its progressive social policies. Related to those policies is the government's prioritization of education. This chart shows us the status of compulsory education across several South American countries. Here we see that Uruguay, in light orange, is not only tied for the highest number of years of education, but it was the first to reach this number by a couple of years, making its mark as a pioneer for educational prioritization. This is, above all, an indication that education access is important to this society. Beyond these graphs, Uruguay's recent history tells an interesting story of independence, innovation, and investments in the future of EdTech. Uruguay, a country of about 3.5 million people, witnessed its neighbors Brazil and Argentina wrestle with COVID-19 and took matters into its own hands. Knowing they couldn't rely on the help of their neighbors during this crisis, they quickly developed their own testing process and disseminated it rapidly throughout the country, making their testing rate fourth highest in the world. Uruguay has a habit of leaning into this independent spirit and placing bets on innovation. In 2007, the country began incorporating information communication technologies into the education system as part of its mission to provide every student a laptop and Wi-Fi access at school. 1 year after its kickoff, the country adopted the program as a national policy, now referred to as Plan Ceibal, which continues to flourish and expand each year. Schools now also incorporate video games, virtual learning, and international pen pals. Its progress is remarkable, but there are some aspects which are cause for concern. While Uruguay forges ahead in the democratization and tech enabling of its education system, there are still many Uruguayan children without these tools. Yes, the students in public school do have great access to laptops and various tech tools, but there are many children not in school. The dropout continues to rise each year, leaving a portion of the population behind. And looking ahead, why is the dropout rate rising? How will this affect their income inequality? And how is the digital divide going to be impacted in the coming decades? How can this educational program be adapted in other countries, particularly in light of political climates and economic health? And how can we avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to this type of development? I'd like to thank my research mentor, Dr. Parmentier, and my very excellent colleagues for their wonderful insights and questions throughout the entire semester to guide me. Thank you.
Go with it. All right. Hello, my name is Penny Gillette. I am a junior at the School of Global Futures and a research fellow working with Dr. Parmentier to study responsible innovations in technology for the developing world. My research is focusing on curbing deforestation, specifically in the Amazon basin. When I started my fellowship, we were in the midst of fire season across the world. As both a sustainability major and a volunteer firefighter, I found myself drawn to the crisis in the Amazon basin, and I was interested in the development of natural spaces following exploitation and disaster. Shortly after beginning my preliminary research, I realized that this particular topic is further down the line, and instead I should focus on mitigation and how responsible technology can curb or combat further deforestation. The Amazon basin spans across 8 rapidly developing countries and 1 territory, approximately the size of the lower 48 United States. Since 1970, an estimated 20% of Brazil's forest has been cleared, and subsequently, most of the fires are in Brazil. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has scaled back environmental regulations in pursuit of commercial exploitation of the Amazon. And this led me to my research question: how can deforestation be mitigated using technology? And since this was my preliminary research, my research methods consisted of literary analyses, observations using Google Earth and ArcGIS, and topical documentaries. So I wanted to take a moment to show the indications of deforestation in the rainforest, and you can easily find this yourself on Google Earth. The lighter portions are deforested, with the hairline deforestation being along the roads and highways, while the larger swashes being from agriculture. You'll notice at the bottom of the image is the state of Mato Grosso, which has been deemed the world's emerging agricultural superpower. This segues into my first observation. Over half of the fertile land on Earth is now farmland. This requires the removal of trees and shrubs, and fire is often the removal method. In the Amazon, there is a dependence on monocultures, a type of agriculture which has a low adaptive capacity and generates biological degradation. Moreover, President Bolsonaro's government is making policy and constitutional changes which allow agriculture and forestry exploitation in the name of growth and progress. There are some pretty interesting and innovative emerging technologies working to combat deforestation, from old cell phones being used to monitor illegal logging to a flock of drones that can plant 400,000 trees in one day. There's a myriad of opportunity in this deforestation dilemma. Something that I want to highlight is that other Amazonian countries are using these innovative technologies to their benefit and could be adopted in Brazil. Recent studies suggest that Amazonian communities adopted polyculture agroforestry 4,500 years ago. This is a method in which crops are interplanted and grown with other crops that complement each other. These crops are more resilient to environmental disturbances, and they boost economic security. This diversified agriculture has proven to be successful and sustainable and can be seen today in the Japanese-Brazilian community of Tome-Asu. The destruction of the Amazon basin has increased rapidly since the Brazilian government slashed its efforts to fight illegal logging and ranching. Moreover, there is a clear correlation between deforestation and agriculture. Sadly, deforestation in the Amazon rainforest has a myriad of cascading effects, and therefore, the impacts will be felt by the global community. And moving forward with my research, I intend to delve deeper into the challenges and opportunities in agribusiness. Since agribusiness is essential to Brazil's economy, I'm interested to explore compromises such as maximum sustainable yield, polyculture, and permaculture. Furthermore, I want to learn how innovative technology paired with regenerative agriculture could transform Brazil's use of the Amazon basin. Thank you.
So hey everyone, my name is Alexia Kamau and I'm currently a senior studying biomedical engineering. With the help of my mentor, Dr. Parmentier, and quite a bit of extensive preliminary research over the years, I decided to narrow my research on a topic I found most interesting, based on my own field research experience in a location most familiar to me also. That topic is the health disparity in sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly the plight of maternal health in rural Kenya. Now, the problems of maternal health lie within two major facets: access and quality of treatment. The problems of maternal health can be highlighted with merely facts, statistics, with one being that sub-Saharan Africa accounts for 86% of maternal deaths worldwide. With that being said, sub-Saharan Africa has the highest maternal mortality ratio, with 533 maternal deaths for every 100,000 births, averaging to about 200,000 deaths every year. As you can see from the figure taken from the World Health Organization, postpartum hemorrhaging is the leading cause of maternal mortality, followed by hypertension, sepsis, etc. Normally, when a mother has a baby, the uterus contracts and the placenta is pushed out. However, in the case of postpartum hemorrhaging, these contractions are not strong enough to apply pressure, causing continuous bleeding of these blood vessels. And this is otherwise known as uterine atony, the leading cause of postpartum hemorrhaging in the developing world. Now, through my years of researching maternal health, looking through case studies, government documents, as you will see from my methodology in the next slide, I reached a gap in my research that I really wanted to know more about. And this gap came upon looking at various statistics. And the ultimate question I was left asking was, why does Kenya's maternal mortality remain so high, despite its high healthcare expenditure and antenatal care coverage in comparison to countries like Ghana and Tanzania? So this was the question I had. In 2018, my methodology began with analyzing Dr. Parmentier's proposed question of what essentially constitutes the success and failures of technology in the developing world. Then I started looking more into the SDGs in comparison to Kenya's plan for maternal health. And then I started finding discrepancies and gaps in my research. And this ultimately led me to perform field research and led me to what I'm doing now, Capstone. Here you will find essentially a succinct diagram of my field research that I had the opportunity to perform in 2019. You will see themes and responses from 3 categories of women I had the opportunity to interview that are making a change within the healthcare system. One was a lady who is works within the Ministry of Health. Another works within a predominant NGO in Kenya, and the last is a chief nurse also in Kenya. So through interviewing these different groups of women, I was able to really analyze different patterns in my research. And I did this in kind of a unique way where I quantified how many times these different participants said key phrases and whatnot. And I also ultimately created this diagram that highlighted the needs and concerns of these participant responses. And this is just a major quote you will see from the previous slide. You can see that you had seen that the major causes or the major needs were things like a need for health systems outreach and a better referral system. And this is just a major quote from one of the nurses in one of rural Kenya's hospitals, where she talks about how she doesn't really know these women that come in. So sometimes they come at threatening situations when it's too late. And ultimately now, after getting a better idea on the problems of maternal health, it led me to, okay, now that I have all this information, what tools can I utilize to actually address the issue? And that's where me and my team are currently working on a device in Capstone where we will market a product for women in the developing world that will treat the leading cause of maternal mortality, which is postpartum hemorrhaging. So that's what that device is. And here are just some of my thanks and acknowledgements. The School for Future of Innovation and Society and my colleagues, Sasha Gavrilov, Penny Gillette, and Chelsea Slay. My mentor, Dr. Parmentier, of course, and also my mentor in Kenya, Dr. Gladwell Gadesha. And of course, last but not least, the women in participation of the study. And I have my contact information below. And that's it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sasha Gavrilov. I'm a student double majoring in applied physics and computer information systems. Today, I'm going to be talking about energy development projects in the developing world. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about geographic inequities that are present in these types of projects, and my attempt to think of a sort of solution for them using things that I've learned in my degrees, which are one would normally think are sort of outside of the realm of like studying social and economic impacts of different projects. So when I started out working on this project 3 semesters ago, I started out from a sort of like energy crisis perspective, because that's what I saw a lot in the media, talking about how lots of developing countries, when they modernize, they're going to be consuming a lot of energy, and that's going to cause some problems. But as I read more into the development projects that are going on, I discovered a bigger underlying issue that needs to be resolved first before total modernization occurs, and that's that there's inequity, specifically in terms of rural communities not receiving these projects. So the two main questions I sort of have are, could I write a program which, given a country's data, will produce a fully inclusive energy supply model? And also in this model, can I realistically maximize the usage of renewable energy? And I'll talk more about in the next couple of slides about how my previous semesters led to me having these questions this semester. So in terms of methodology, I did lots of literature review centered on the topics of energy poverty, renewable energy, energy consumption analysis, and energy infrastructure design. And then in particular, this semester, I looked at what energy consumption models exist out there, and also about sort of like principles about how I could go about building my own model, which is still ongoing. And so my first key finding, which is going back to when I started this, is that developing countries actually are leaders in renewable energy, which is really surprising. And as a matter of fact, in 2015, developing countries surpassed more developed countries, I'm using that form of terminology, in terms of spending on renewable energy. Now, part of this, of course, is driven by the fact, for example, that India is considered to be a developing country and it has a lot of resources, so it spends a lot. But still, there are other statistics like Kenya being the #1 country in the world in terms of solar panels per capita. So it's a very interesting observation. The next thing I found is that in terms of energy development projects, there's actually a divide in terms of the way it's implemented. Oftentimes, government target large population clusters. And on this slide here, I have two images that really contrast this. It's from Brazil. You know, these two pictures look like they come from totally different worlds, but they're actually in the same country. And so the question is why are there communities that are on the left that exist in a country that can have things that are like on the right? And then the sort of third topic in terms of reading was looking in terms of modeling and gaps in energy modeling. So I found two types of gaps. One is, once again, looking at those rural communities who are often excluded from development projects. And then the other gap is that a lot of the literature on modeling comes from business and consulting companies. For example, McKinsey & Company, a very prominent consulting company. And I'll talk a little bit more about this analysis here in just a bit. But basically, McKinsey & Company, I'm using it as like a sort of case example. They did a study, I think it was in 24 developing countries, trying to analyze energy consumption patterns, and they could only explain about 60% of the energy variances. And one big factor they didn't take into account is demographics of a country, and that's what I'm trying to include into my model, is how demographics of a country drive energy consumption as well. And so that's one thing I'm trying to take into account. In terms of summary and conclusions, right now, I'm still ongoing in making the actual model. On the right here, I have a big sort of completed diagram for how I could ethically go about this data collection using standard business modeling process notation. And basically the idea is that I would do localized community surveys of energy consumption in order to take the data in an ethical manner and then use it properly to propose like a final model. And thank you everyone who's helped me over the course of this project. Thank you to Professor Parmentier and also Alexia, Penny, and Chelsea. And thank you to SFIS. I'm really happy that, it's interesting that I got to use, when I started this 3 semesters ago, I didn't really expect that I'd be using so much of the knowledge that I'm studying in my 2 degrees in this project, but now I'm starting to bring that in. That's really awesome to me.
Hello, thank you for attending this presentation. My name is Cortez White Jr., and I am a senior at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. Under the supervision of Dr. Fasim Hussein, I did my research this semester on the current digital afterlife services and its connection with COVID-19. The purpose of this project is to bring attention to the digital afterlife industry through recent contexts and trends involving COVID-19. Digital afterlife is the online presence and digital footprint left through digital services. The number of profiles may outnumber the profiles of the living by the end of this century, depending on the growth of online users as demonstrated by the graphs. This has led to new opportunities to commercialize and monetize the digital afterlife of internet users. While digital afterlife studies began to gain traction around a decade ago, there is a deficiency of ethical frameworks for the management of digital remains to this day. As technology and digital services become more embedded in our daily lives, the number of dead profiles will continue to increase. What does this mean in the wake of a global pandemic? The problem I was researching on this semester was to find out how the digital afterlife industry has responded to the pandemic. I was interested on this topic because of the lack of media exposure and peer-reviewed studies regarding the management of digital afterlife, and figured that the unprecedented occurrence of the COVID-19 pandemic could help get the digital afterlife industry more attention. My main research questions were, why is digital afterlife a critical issue? What are the types of digital afterlife services available, and who are the providers? Many different startups were formed to address different topics within the industry. With this in mind, I focused more on digital afterlife startups that had a connection with COVID-19 and their frameworks for creation. I am also exploring how are people mourning the deceased during the pandemic, and are more people aware of their digital afterlife? After reviewing existing literature of the digital afterlife, I came across the ethical framework by Carl Oman and Luciano Floridi. Information management services are companies that assist users with digital asset management problems, usually through the form of a digital will or archive services. Post-image messaging services offer a final goodbye message that is sent to desired recipients upon the death of the user. Online memorial services are orchestrated primarily towards the bereaved to provide an online space to mourn or grieve the deceased. Recreation services use personal data to create a chatbot-like imitation of the deceased user to mimic their social behavior and generate new messages based on older data. The proliferation of online users in response to the pandemic, as well as the rapid influx of deaths, has provided new outlets for studying the digital afterlife industry. The ways in which we mourn and grieve the deceased has changed as families attend online funeral live streams on Zoom. On top of that, the unprecedented death of thousands of people raises alarms in some about what happens to their digital data once they die. Presented in upcoming slides are 2 relatively new digital afterlife startups, Good Trust and Next Lifebook. One example of an information management service that was recently created and deployed in response to COVID-19 is Good Trust, a company founded by Richard Steiber. Good Trust aims to help families protect the digital lives of their loved ones by securely storing and managing the digital legacy of social media accounts, other websites, and important documents. Good Trust will directly reach out to all global websites the user selects while keeping them updated in the process to ensure requested actions are completed safely. NextLife Book is both an information management service and posthumous messaging service. Families are able to create voice messages or record videos to send to their loved ones in the future. The patent-pending InsurTech company is based in Singapore and acts as a one-stop directory for physical and digital afterlife services. NextLife Book offers similar services to Good Trust, but what makes this company unique is their ambition to partner with National Council for Social Studies organizations and other businesses to provide employees with a NextLife Book account as part of their employee package. The digital afterlife industry remains uncharted territory in terms of guidelines and frameworks for digital service providers to follow. Additionally, the occurrence of COVID-19 demands more awareness and education of digital afterlife and calls for the ethical and transparent management of digital remains by service providers. Next steps will consist of conducting additional research on digital afterlife and startups to better understand their individual frameworks and guidelines. This will help in my endeavor to assist Dr. Hussein with the construction of a peer-reviewed paper to demonstrate the noteworthy findings. Thank you for your undivided time and attention. I would like to thank Dr. Hussein for his assistance and guidance throughout the duration of the project. I would also like to thank Dr. Emma Froh, Alicia Thompson, and SFIS for giving me the opportunity to participate in the fellowship program to help contribute to an interesting and uncharted topic.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Dilan Evans. I'm currently studying environmental engineering at ASU, and I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Crowther on their research project this semester. It focused on bridging the gap between assignment and assessment using test question templates, or what we call TQTs. And I thought that this was a really interesting project to be a part of because I'm really familiar with STEM assignments and assessments, and I'm interested in how they could possibly change in the future. So an overview of test question templates, or TQTs. So what are they? Well, a TQT is not a question itself, but rather a generator that is designed specifically for variation. It provides a student with an input, an output, an example, and a key, and then the student can take in this presented information in very different sections of the template in order to create new study questions in order to give them more practice and help them learn. This is designed currently for STEM classes, and for the purposes of this project, we looked mostly at biology because that's what Dr. Crowther is involved in. And the purposes are, again, to connect assignment with assessment and give students more practice. And they also allow teachers to assess their students at the higher order cognitive levels by focusing on more of the analysis and the understanding of the content as opposed to the recollection and the memorization that we often see in STEM. And it's used for both students and instructors alike. So my first question was, are other biology professors using similar strategies? And I looked at this by accessing a journal online called CourseSource, which is where biology teachers can post their lesson plans for other teachers to use and reference. I filtered these lesson plans looking for mostly introductory lectures and avoiding labs, and then compiled my findings into a spreadsheet that looked at the similarities of these lessons to TQTs, if they included example exam questions, if they encouraged students to create their own practice questions, and other similar questions. My second question was, do students perceive that TQTs help them learn? And for this question, we actually surveyed 2 of Dr. Crowther's classes that had previous experiences with TQTs and asked them pretty general questions about their experiences and how we can improve. These surveys were then taken into the qualitative analysis software MaxQDA, and then they were coded accordingly to see if any patterns or themes would emerge. So the findings from the literature. While reading the lessons on CourseSource, it was found that most of these lesson learning objectives were already aligned with TQT ideas. And this means that the lessons often attempted to focus on analyzing the material and forming conclusions, as opposed to more of that fact recollection and memorization. And many of these lesson learning objectives could easily be tested and varied, I guess, which is, again, a key concept of TQTs. Additionally, we found that there was a severe lack of practice questions within the lessons that I looked at. As you can see on the figure to the right here, about 97% of the lessons didn't encourage students to create their own practice questions to help them study for tests. Most of the lessons had strict worksheets or exam questions that didn't allow students to really go out on their own and create their own practice questions, which again is a key concept of TQTs. So the findings from the student reviews. First of all, we found that they were used without requirement. TQTs were not required by Dr. Crowther in his classes, but we found that the majority of the students took advantage of them and used them throughout the semester. The graphic on the left here shows the top codes that were found when doing the qualitative analysis in Max QDA. The most coded response, as you can see, was that students thought that TQTs helped them study for exams. This touches base with the main ideas of test question templates, which is to connect assignments with assessments. The second most coded section was an increase in comprehension. Students believe that having the ability to create their own practice questions allowed them to better understand the material. And tying into that, the third most coded, most commonly, referenced code was adjusting the question, which is the key concept of TQTs, is being able to manipulate the question, the inputs, the outputs, and get more practice and a better understanding, which ties into the other two codes. So in summary, the literature showed us that the lesson learning objectives that I looked at were TQT-like already, which leads us to believe that TQTs could be fluidly integrated into the pre-existing lessons fairly easily. Also, TQTs can fill a major hole because we found that a lot of the lessons that I examined did not allow students to create their own practice questions. And the next steps of this project would definitely be to get more data on student performance and see how TQTs affect grades. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Crowther for helping me out this semester.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Smith, and with me I have my fellow researcher, Wendt. And for the past few months, we've been working under the direction of Professor Finch studying imagination. And so we're excited to be here today, and we hope you enjoy our presentation on imaginative practices for resilience and anticipation. So to begin, we wanted to offer you some insight into our process, particularly how we went about gathering our research. So the first steps we took were gathering videos, academic journals, published articles, and books on the topic of imagination. Wendt and I were then able to summarize our readings into a shared form, and we ultimately created a literature review. After this process was complete, we moved on to step 2, which was creating a taxonomy on imagination. And with this taxonomy, we broke up our findings into various subgroups, such as theories, definitions, and applications of imagination. And then in order to obtain more data for this taxonomy, we decided that we were going to conduct interviews on field professionals. And this approach would allow us to see how other people define imagination in various settings. So, what is imagination? This is a question that many people have sought an answer to, but the reality is there isn't one concrete answer. And so Wendt and I today wanted to focus on 4 main themes associated with imagination. And these themes are the default network, cognitive attitude and self-generated information, application subtypes, and the individual versus collaborative effort.
So one school of thought to define imagination encapsulates the default network. And essentially this is one of the modes of information processing that the brain leans toward when attention is relaxed. However, we find that this is an incomplete definition of imagination, primarily because it doesn't necessarily describe the why and the what of imagination. So we've included cognitive attitude and self-generated information to bridge that gap. And what this includes is perception, social context, and futures thinking. So what we're trying to account for is the psychological, sociological, and the temporal lens that you can look at imagination under. So we're essentially just trying to incorporate internal bias, the prescribed ways of things, and then also the tension between the current and potential orders that have implications for how people imagine, what they imagine, and why they imagine.
So following this, we have the 8 subtypes of imagination used in daily life. In the far left column, we have effectuative imagination, intellectual or constructive imagination, and strategic imagination. And these 3 fall into the most practical and academic types of imagination. And one example of constructive imagination would be Charles Darwin's research on evolution. So he went about conducting his own research, and from this, he was able to generate a new hypothesis. And then in the middle section, we have empathy and emotional imagination, and these are all centralized around emotional intelligence. And one example of emotional imagination would be cognitive behavioral therapy, in which clients are tasked with placing themselves in an emotional state in order to receive therapy. On the far right column, we have dreams, memory reconstruction, and imaginative fantasy, and these fall into the most idealistic and creative types of imagination. And then one example of imaginative fantasy would be the creation of a fantasy world in a novel. So now we're going to look at the differences between individual and collaborative efforts. So individual imagination refers to the innate ability of people to think creatively. So this process is evident in people who are considered solitary geniuses, and examples of these would be writers, artists, inventors, and creators. And these are people who are able to develop new concepts from their own mental capacity. However, there is a question about if this truly individual imagination actually exists due to the idea that information and ideas are constantly being influenced. So collaborative imagination refers to imagination that occurs when there's a common imaginary landscape. And this can be exemplified in something such as a utopian society. And people have come together to imagine what they believe a perfect society is. And so, as I had mentioned earlier, the idea of the truly imaginative or truly individual imagination is slightly flawed. And this is due to the interaction between individual and collaborative imagination. So individual inspiration can come from the works of other people. So although there isn't a direct collaboration, the two are actually working in tandem to imagine and create a new concept.
So moving on to the next portion of our research, we conducted interviews. And what we did was we conducted 5 interviews. We are still in the interview process, and these are 2 of them from an individual that comes from an urban planning background and then an individual that comes from a theater background. And their definitions of imagination as we asked them and as they replied are shown on your screen. However, something that we found interesting was that the urban planning individual that we interviewed, how he applied imagination was to design and think about and imagine the perfect city, because the foundational ground of urban planning is the assumption that the cities as they exist are insufficient. And for the individual that we interviewed from the theater background, she had a very interesting comment about how imagination is changing in her field. So she referenced the introduction of a director that has more of an imposing and more supervisory role in directing a crew. So as you have many individuals working part of a production that each have their own imaginations and visions of what the production can look like, it's the director that's actually sort of fielding the imaginative landscape and also orienting it in the direction that they feel it needs to go. So what we notice is that even though imagination doesn't necessarily imply action, that actionability is something that's very important to how people imagine and what they imagine. And we also find that there is this search for newness and ingenuity within imagination. And another thing is that as we asked our interview participants, as well as fielded the literature review, we found that there are techniques to improve and optimize imaginative states. And that has to do with mindset, with mental and physical state, and the like. All right, so that concludes our presentation. And we would just like to say thank you so much for the SFIS for allowing us to be here, and also our FA, Dr. Finn. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lauryn Remmers, and I am a 3rd student here at ASU. I am on the pre-medical track, and I am studying kinesiology. This semester, I worked on a project titled Deep Brain Stimulation Surgeries at Your Own Risk, and I was working on this with Dr. Katina Michael. And this is also part of a bigger project I've been working on the past year about body modifications and their relation to health. And so body modifications are becoming more prominent in our society. And so over the past 2 semesters, I have spent some time defining body modifications and defining them. I've also been looking into their potential health implications and overall just the relation to health. And so for this project on this semester, I took a deeper dive into deep brain stimulation. So deep brain stimulation is a type of body modification that falls into the medical subcategory. And so what exactly is deep brain stimulation? So deep brain stimulation is a surgical procedure in which electrodes are implanted into the brain to provide electrical stimulation to regions which produce movement. And so this has been used to treat diseases such as Parkinson's, essential tremor, dystonia, and OCD. And so put simply, this is basically an implant that is put into your brain that produces electricity to help with the treatment of movement disorders. And so my research question that I was looking into is, what are the policies and procedures of deep brain stimulation? And so the goal of this project was to look into how doctors and medical professionals are dealing with deep brain stimulation and how well they're educating their patients about the policies and procedures surrounding DBS. And so what I did was I looked at 15 different hospitals and medical centers across the country. And so I was looking at their websites in relation to deep brain stimulation and looking for keywords such as risks, procedures, and side effects. And so overall, I was looking to see what kind of information they were providing to the patients and how well they're explaining what the procedure is and how they're dealing with any risk and side effects that may come with a procedure. What I found as a common trend across all of the different hospitals is that they were all really good at explaining the aftercare for the surgery. And so this was split into two parts, what happens in the hospital and what happens at home. And so in the hospital, basically the doctor is just going to keep an eye on the patient, look for any complications, and provide the instructions for home care. And then at home, they're having the patients basically just keep an eye on the incision and making sure that it stays clean, that it's dry, and that they're looking for any signs of drainage, which can be an indication of infection. And all 15 of the medical centers also did a good job of explaining the risks that come with the surgery. And so, as always, infection is a common risk. With DBS, there's also the potential of the electrodes moving, leaking of cerebrospinal fluid, difficulty concentrating and seizures, as well as a headache. They also explain the long-term effects of DBS. And so DBS has both positive and negative effects. And so positive effects, it's going to improve the symptoms of that movement disorder, improving the tremors and slowness of movement. It will also decrease the amount of medication that is needed to improve their symptoms. On the negative side, the patient in the future is going to have to be cognizant of what kind of activities and where they are because of their DBS. And so if they were to go through an airport security, they're going to have to inform them that they have a DBS in case that the DBS was going to be interfering with the magnetics. Also, the user should be cognizant when they're doing MRIs to making sure that they're not, their devices aren't interfering. And so overall, all the websites were really sufficient in providing information about aftercare, risk, and the long-term effects of DBS. However, none of the websites really provided information about the policies in place if something were to malfunction with the device. And so if you have an implant in your brain that's producing electrical stimulation, you would think that something would go wrong and you would want to know what would happen if something went wrong. But none of these websites, at least as far as I was able to find, were able to explain what would happen. And so in the future, I would like to interview medical professionals and learn more about their perspective about how they are dealing with DBS, and also look into more specific forms of body modification specifically related to the health field. So I would like to thank Dr. Michael and SFIS for this opportunity to perform and share this research. I've been really fortunate to be a part of this program for 3 semesters now, and hope to continue to do it in the future. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Zane Encinas, and today I'll be taking you through my work and experiences this semester with my project, Creating a Consensus Definition of Environmental Public Art under the supervision of Dr. Jenkins. Throughout this presentation, you'll see numerous images of public art pieces located both here in Tempe and elsewhere throughout the world. Many of these art installations had the potential to be deemed environmental public art, and some maybe not. For the purpose of their presence in this presentation is simply to illustrate the need to move beyond the adage, I know it when I see it. Environmental public art is a relatively recent phenomenon, both in its material form and its presence in academic literature. There is a purposive nature of this art in that it is created with the intent of generating affective engagement between audiences and the changing climate. It finds itself at the intersections of the humanities and environmental sciences, and thus involves many diverse perspectives among scholars, artists, audiences, etc. Ultimately, there is an objective to engender a collective environmental outcome. However, existing literature has yet to really fully explore this potential. As of today, the study's purpose of, wrong slide. Prior to attempting to answer my research question, what is environmental public art, I conducted a literature review of existing surrounding environmental art and psychology research. We also use the Delphi method, which is an iterative process in which the researcher facilitates groups of experts. And for this study, we started with a 7-question survey that asked experts to identify characteristics, commonalities, and examples they consider to be fundamental to environmental public art. And as a grounded theory approach, oftentimes those responses are coded and created an initial consensus definition, but unfortunately due to time constraints and lack of sufficient number of timely responses, I was unable to really proceed to the second stage of the Delphi method, which is the joint interview. And during this interview, participants would be on a Zoom call and through the facilitation of the researcher would work to revise the aggregate definition until every participant is satisfied. For approximately the first 2 months, I spent a majority of my time drafting the IRB application for this study. And during this time, I drafted the study protocol, consent forms, and recruitment email that would be sent out to prospective participants. This provided me the opportunity to draw upon my knowledge gained from my city certification and witness firsthand the strict scrutiny the IRB gives to that's necessary for ensuring ethical research. The drafting of the documentation was certainly an iterative process that entailed a lot of back and forth in the means of revising and editing. So the study's purposive and heterogeneous sample included attendees and invitees from the SYNC workshop, Aesthetic Perspectives on Environmental Problems, held in January of 2020. Amongst these individuals were artists, scientists, environmental public art scholars, and funders and directors. Recruitment emails were sent out to an equivalent amount of those individuals, and from those categorical pools ensured responses were representative and in turn promoted a more complete and comprehensive consensus definition. So we have received 6 responses out of the desired 15 thus far, and although the data set is incomplete, there are 3 primary themes that have showed up across the majority of these responses. The first is that of intention. Participants emphasize the need for environmental public art to be created with the intent in mind to produce new connections between the audience and the environment. Similarly, many respondents contend that the installation must aim to draw the attention of the public toward an environmental issue. And the third was the stipulation that the definition for environmental public art ought to be flexible. During the literature review process, I focused on environmental attitudes and behaviors and art evaluation. Within these 2 primary categories, I looked at literature from various fields, including psychology, biology, law, and the environmental sciences. First, there appears to be no existing explicit definition of environmental public art, which affirms the purpose of this study. Second, there is a wide breadth of examples of environmental public art, ranging from sculptures, paintings, to even an online dating app that matches participants to Joshua trees. Third is the significance of creating a personal connection with the art. So in addition to the work I was doing in regards to creating a consensus definition, I was also engaging in scholarly content review, editing, and feedback for a paper that's in the initial stages of being written. An interesting feature of this paper is its ability to bridge the gap between an all too common dispassionate academic paper and the lived experiences of people interacting with art and nature. This work also created the perfect avenue for me to integrate the literature review mentioned previously and for me to incorporate some of the readings and concepts from my previous coursework as an undergraduate. And finally, the next steps, especially considering the incomplete data set for this semester, is to expanding recruitment and continuing the data collection process, and then furthering that by using data analysis methods to look at those responses and generate the first round of a consensus definition, and then proceed with the joint interviews with those participants to further revise that definition until we reach a point where everyone is satisfied. And finally, let me extend my thanks and acknowledgements to Dr. Jenkins, Dr. Cho, and Dr. Crowther.
Okay, so the scenario of the game is this. As carbon emissions rise exponentially and the last icebergs melt, citizens of Earth cling to the dwindling vestiges of clean air and water. World leaders meet at the United Nations headquarters and agree they must look to the stars. As your country's leading synthetic biologist, you are assigned the monumental task of making Mars a hospitable planet. You spend a few weeks in a spacecraft hurtling towards the red planet, equipped with a limited supply of food, water, clothing, and 3 vials of exceptionally precious strains of cyanobacteria. As other synthetic biologists start landing their spacecraft on Mars, it quickly becomes clear that you are not alone in your race to colonize the red planet. Martian soil is inhospitable to crops, but the bacteria will create the fertilizer needed to turn barren soils into high-yielding farms, and will produce the building materials and energy you need to start building infrastructure. With this tremendous responsibility on your shoulders, you know there's only one thing left to do: start building. That's sort of the premise of the game and the backstory that we built into what players are doing as they play the game. So this is a strategy-based board game inspired by games like Settlers of Catan and Photosynthesis. The board consists of hexagonal tiles representing resources. Players collect these resources and trade them in to build structures like farms, colonies, recycling centers, and tunnels on Mars. which in turn give players synthesis points. The first player to reach a target number of points wins the game. The cyanobacteria resources allow players to collect different strains of synthetic bacteria, including a concrete producing strain, an energy producing strain, and a fertilizing strain. Okay. Players can also purchase discovery cards, which provide them with various benefits. I have one pictured on the right for improved growth medium. This doubles their cyanobacteria resources. Additionally, they can collect fungi cards. These can be used to clear the landfill or build a recycling center. The way the landfill works is where anytime a player spends resources to build something, those resources are added to the landfill. If the landfill gets large enough, all players will take a penalty. But players can clear it out by spending a fungi card, which is meant to be a strain of decomposing fungi, which can help mitigate this problem. So we've adopted various strains of cyanobacteria into the game, but we made these based off of real world research studies and interests. So we have a concrete producing strains, which can be used by players to build tunnels. That's based off research done on bioconcrete. We also have an energy producing strain. This is based off of research on synthetics biology's ability to possibly synthesize fuels or oils. In this game, the player can use these strains to help build colonies. All this is just to convey to players that synthetic biology can be used to potentially build things or just serve as really valuable resources. In the game, we've also incorporated a fertilizing strain. This is based off of research using nitrogen fixing synthetic biology to convert inhospitable soil into fertile soil. Players in the game can use this strain to build farms and recycling centers. Also, players can collect fungi. These are meant to be super decomposing strains, which can be used to clear the landfill. As previously discussed, these cards are meant to illustrate that microbes can be helpful, not just for building things, but also for breaking things down, things that could potentially be harmful. We've also created a backstory document where we have certain sections to present a more in-depth look at synthetic biology for the average person playing the game. Here, our goal is to be presenting a slightly more in-depth, though hopefully very digestible introduction to what is synthetic biology, why is it exciting or possibly interesting for travel in space, why is cyanobacteria specifically interesting from a research standpoint, as well as other applications of synthetic biology. We've constructed this currently in a sort of question-answer format for people to read in a separate document. So there's a lot of ethical questions that come up with space colonization and changing ecosystems and dealing with space, debris, and waste. We decided to implement some of these challenges into the game, like in the case of the landfill, but we also have these questions also in the backstory document to address some of these questions. And what we're attempting to do with this section is not really give definitive answers to any of these, but just to present them as real dilemmas and ethical problems that come with space colonization. Like, is it appropriate to alter an environment or ecosystem of another planet? Is it ethical to colonize another planet? Could synthetic biology be used to develop more sustainable societies, etc. So as far as what we've achieved and next step, what we have done is create a fairly developed set of rules based off the mechanics we have been developing, as well as accompanying documents and information, scenarios, and rules. In the future, we'd like to work on developing a physical prototype of the game. We've been playing the game virtually, but we have yet to road test this game with new players and the public. And we still potentially have work there in continuing to make sure that our game is understandable and successfully conveying those concepts that we want to be conveying. And that's it.
Today, I'm going to be presenting on the global patterns of illegal marine turtle take and trade. I've been working on this paper for about 1.5 years now with Jesse Sanko and all of the wonderful co-authors that are also listed here. And I'm very excited to announce that we are currently preparing this for submission to PNAS, and that should be happening within the next few weeks coming up here. So that's very exciting since so much work has gone into this. All right, so globally, the illegal wildlife trade is the third most profitable black market after drugs and firearms. And there's a lot of endangered species affected by this. And some of these species are marine turtles. And that's because they're valued for their meat, shell, eggs, oil, skin, and their internal organs. And some of the major drivers of this illegal trade include cultural traditions, poverty, and then also a lack of law enforcement. All right, so there's already been analysis of legal marine turtle take and trade worldwide, but this is the first analysis that is looking at globally illegal marine turtle take and trade. So to do this, we completed a literature review that included primary literature, gray literature, which is reports, and then also media articles from 1990 to 2020. And then we also completed surveys of in-country experts that helped to fill some data gaps, and they provided estimates for 2000 to 2009 and 2010 to 2015. So here we can see the hotspots of take and trade over time. In the 1990s, the major hotspot was Southeast Asia. And then moving on to the 2000s, we see Central America, part of South America, and then the Caribbean pop up as a hotspot. Also Southeast Africa, and then Southeast Asia remains a hotspot. And then in the 2010s, these hotspots remain roughly the same. However, there is less take and trade overall compared to the 2000s. So here we see a graph of take and trade by region for the 2010s. And you can see that the Americas had the vast majority of take and trade, which was concentrated in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean, as we saw in the previous slide. And then Africa had the second highest amount of take, and that was concentrated in Southeast Africa. And then Asia had the next highest amount of take and trade, which was concentrated in Southeast Asia. And then Oceania and Europe had the least amount of take, with Europe having very, very little. So here we have a graph of take and trade by species for the 2010s, and I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that this graph is square root transformed just to highlight the differences between the species. So we can see that about half of the turtles were not reported at the species level, but where they were reported, that other half, 95% of them were either hawksbills or green turtles. And then olive ridleys, loggerheads, and leatherbacks were taken very little in the 2010s. So here we have a graph of take and trade by income for the 2010s, and we can see that low-income countries overall had a higher amount of take and trade than high-income countries. And then low-income countries had higher subsistence use when compared to high-income countries. And then high-income countries had greater commercial use compared to low-income countries. And then overall, both high-income and low-income countries has a pretty high amount of unknown take and trade. So this might be an interesting area to research in the future. All right, so just to wrap up the results that I talked about, over 1.1 million turtles were illegally taken or traded from 1990 to 2020 across 65 different countries. And then the global hotspots that we identified included the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, Southeast Africa, and also Southeast Asia. Green and hawksbill turtles made up the majority of global illegal take and trade where it was reported by species. And then finally, the majority of turtles were taken in low-income countries, with subsistence use being more prevalent in low-income countries and commercial use being more prevalent in high-income countries. So the main limitation of this study is that our estimates are likely to represent only a small fraction of the true magnitude of illegal take and trade, and this is due to the clandestine nature of the activity, research biases, and data gaps. The major implication of this is that illegal take and trade likely represents a major threat to the conservation of marine turtles worldwide. Therefore, we recommend that enforcement efforts and targeted outreach focus on the hotspots of activity that we identified in this study. So finally, I just want to say a big thank you to my advisor, Dr. Jessie Sanko, all the wonderful co-authors of this paper, and all those who provided survey data and helped with data collection. And then also I want to thank the School for the Future of Innovation in Society for providing me with this research fellowship. Thank you all for watching.
What do you think of when you hear the word foundry? Is it sparks and fire, smoke and steam, or something entirely different? To give some background, excuse me. Over the past couple of decades, new spaces have begun to emerge in the synthetic biology industry, a sector of the biotechnology space that specializes in co-opting biology to produce novel and innovative solutions to some of the world's most difficult challenges. These spaces are often called biofoundries or biofabs, and they are pitching themselves as leaders in a new industrial revolution. I was curious why this terminology gained so much traction and what these new spaces were trying to invoke. So I decided to investigate the uses of two base words that they seem to have stuck bio at the beginning of, foundries and fabs. I found that fab generally meant semiconductor chip factory, and the term foundry commonly referred to metal casting. Foundries, fabs, and biofoundries are all functionally similar, but differences emerged when I investigated their intended purposes. All three were designed for high throughput production of their respective outputs, but these products serve different functions. Metal foundries make components for machines that make other components. Semiconductor fabs and biofoundries make a final product, the chip or organism. It's worth noting that semiconductor fab is interchangeable with semiconductor foundry, but I will be exclusively using the fab language. So, our first comparison, inputs and outputs. It might just take a minute to change. There we go. Metal foundries use types of granular sand and various binding agents to make molds for the component they are casting, and then molten metal is carefully poured into the mold. Biofoundries design and edit DNA through software and grow organisms that are used for a specific purpose. Biossance is a spin-off company of one of these biofoundries, and they use this process to create personal care products, excuse me, such as the one you see on the slide. Semiconductor fabs often design chips using similar software and then produce them in an automated assembly line. Oh, I think it skipped ahead. Oh no, it's fine. All right, go ahead and switch to the other one, sorry. There we go. Both biofoundries and semiconductor fabs use processes that are so tiny and precise that a lot of the work has to be done by specially designed hardware and software. Metal foundries are usually require more manual labor and often produce components that would, for example, be used in the machines that do most of the manual work in biofoundries and semiconductor fabs. The inputs and outputs of semiconductor fabs and metal foundries are most similar, but semiconductor fabs and biofoundries are more similar in the processes they use. The scale of these various factories differ quite a bit. Biofoundries vary in size, with some as small as a single lab bench and others as large as a factory floor. Fabs are usually massive and require tons of piping and environmental controls, and are typically seen as a huge infrastructure investment. Foundries are fairly large, but contain lots of vertical space to accommodate large, heavy machinery that does a lot of the heavy lifting. Overall, biofoundries are smaller than metal foundries, and metal foundries are smaller than semiconductor fabs. In semiconductor fabs and biofoundries, both have clean working environments, but semiconductor fabs are nearly sterile. Semiconductor fab employees generally have to wear protective equipment in order to keep the chips safe from contamination. Foundries, on the other hand, are often very dirty. Foundry employees wear protective equipment to keep themselves safe from dangerous gases and molten metal. Biofoundries usually don't require more than standard lab safety equipment. Semiconductor fabs are the most sterile of the three, with foundries being the least, and biofoundries falling somewhere in between. So, metal foundries can only reuse their molding sand so many times before it becomes an industrial waste byproduct that becomes problematic to dispose of. Semiconductor fabs expend a lot of energy in their manufacturing processes and produce chips that will eventually become e-waste that is hard to break down. Is it stuck? There it is. Semiconductor fabs expend a lot of energy in their manufacturing processes and produce chips that will eventually become e-waste that is hard to break down. Biofoundries may present some risks, such as the potential consequences of releasing lab-made organisms into existing ecosystems, but synthetic biology is widely regarded as a very clean industry, unlike metal casting and chip manufacturing. So after doing all of this cross-comparison, I found that embracing the term biofoundry was actually pretty ingenious. Foundries can refer to both metal casting and semiconductor chip manufacturing, and biofoundries borrow qualities from both processes. For an industry such as synthetic biology that has a habit of positioning themselves as pivotal in the next industrial revolution, which will likely involve the convergence of biology and technology to create the future of manufacturing, this terminology ends up doing a lot of work. So to wrap up, thank you so much for your time. I would like to thank my research advisor, Dr. Fro, without whom this project would have never been conceived. And I love diving into this topic, and I'm looking forward to what we tackle next.